Welcome to this week's Gramophone Podcast. I'm Jonathan Whiting, editorial assistant, and this week I'm talking to Soprano Rowan Pierce about her brand new album, out today, Tra la fiamme with Channel Classics. The album features the lesser well-known and lesser heard secular cantatas by Handel, Bach and Vivaldi, all intimately scored for soprano and orchestra. We talk about the chemistry between singer and soloist, the importance of recitatives, and how the morals and messages of these 300-year-old works still resonate with us today. Well, thank you very much for joining me, Rowan.
It's a pleasure.
So, my first sort of reaction to this album is that I can tell that a lot of thought and a lot of heart has gone into the choice of the repertoire and the order of the repertoire. What was your involvement in the producing of that?
I think initially, so I met Ashley Solomon at the Royal College of Music when I was a student, and I was very lucky that he believed in giving lots of performance opportunities to his students, because I think you learn on the job and you learn what works and what doesn't work in terms of repertoire, when to put fast things, when to put slow things, that kind of thing. And we often used to do an aria called Sweet Bird from Handel's L'Allegro, and it's a really cool interplay between Baroque flute and soprano. And so originally we'd thought we would do a sort of smash hit album of flute and soprano. And then in the end, we sort of thought perhaps it was fair to everyone in Florilegium if we shed it out a bit. And it seemed more manageable to have a more coherent disc of two cantatas plus this uplifting kind of exclamation mark at the end of it with the Vivaldi. And both cantatas very happily sat within that. We call it secular, but obviously the Bach does mention God in a kind of philosophical sense of how to live, but they're both lessons, sort of trying to teach humanity something in a way, which is why Alleluia is helpful at the end. You've been through it. It's not a concept disc, but if you listen to it like that, then you've been through this sort of challenging philosophical thought, and then finally you've got a bit of a release at the end.
Yeah, because these are sort of the cantatas that in previous recordings you sort of have just seen on these massive anthology recordings of every cantata Bach's done. So it's nice they've sort of been singled out, and you know they wrote so much, and it's just nice to hear these little gems that you don't often hear very much.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's definitely a challenge for everyone. And we had brilliant Reiko, who plays viola da gamba so well. And it was a piece that I'd done actually with Ashley at the college, probably about 10 years prior to this. So we both had studied it together, and then we could bring the rest of Flori in. And the Bach cantata was thankfully one that he hadn't recorded before. And it also gives you all those colours that Flori have so well at their disposal with all the instrumentalists that lend themselves so well to this repertoire. So we tried to use everything we had in the toolbox, as it were.
Yeah, and it's nice, especially the Bach. It's got this, actually the whole album is that it's a lot more sort of smaller scale than our sort of we expect from Handel and Bach with sort of full choirs. And there's a lot more of this interplay with the solo instruments, particularly in the Bach. How does it feel when you're sort of there recording or performing with these obligato instruments? Do you feel like they're singers with you or your instruments with them? How does this sort of interplay work out?
Yeah, one thing I love about doing this kind of music is I grew up making music with people. It wasn't sort of us and them or anything like that you might have heard on the grapevine about different singers or things like that. It was a really shared effort. When I was growing up, sort of with my family, we have a bandstand in the town I grew up, Saltburn, and we used to sort of play in the rain and people would walk by. But it would be a really nice way of communicating with each other and not have to talk about necessarily serious things or teenagehood or whatever. And it was just, that's kind of how music feels to me, is a shared something in the room. And so, yeah, when I was at college, and it sort of pushed me towards this HP faculty, the historical performance faculty, because it allowed me as a singer to be that just extra cog in the wheel and not necessarily at the front. And I think, as you put so nicely, that the Bach especially allows you to do that. And it really is, when we recorded it, we were all facing each other. It wasn't a sort of performance. And actually we have since performed it in concert 3 or 4 times after we recorded it around the UK. And it's a completely different experience having people behind you rather than being able to look them in the eyes. So it was a lovely experience actually to just be able to feel it together in the room in the church that we recorded in.
And the Handel tra le fiamme, it's almost like a mini opera. I thought it's quite dramatic. It's sort of it's the Icarus myth, isn't it, from the point of view of his father? How do you encounter it, thinking of yourself as a character, or how do you sort of bring out the text in a work like that?
Yeah, it's such a good question because it's something I've actually had to learn quite quickly, I think, with recording. It wasn't something I studied at music college. You can kind of take some subjects that let you do recordings, but ultimately what I experienced is learning quite quickly on the job, and you sort of listen back and you think, oh, I thought that I was doing that emotion, and it just sounds like a robot. So it's that's one of my challenges with recording is I think I'm doing it, but when I listen back, I'm probably not. And this is a great cantata for that sort of thing. It's almost like a Jackanory, sit in front of me and let me tell you a story, and maybe you'll learn a lesson from it, but hopefully you'll just be listening to Reiko doing amazingly virtuosic stuff on her gamba, and hearing, well, Handel writes it in, or this, you can hear like the butterflies with all the trills. And so it's not, it's definitely there in the score. I think recording it when someone can't see what you're doing with your face and you really have to bring the colours in with your voice. I'm still working on it, but I think as much as possible listening to the colours in the instruments around you, and a huge amount of study of the text beforehand, especially in the Bach as well, but also in the Handel, just to have that sort of narration and then to go into the colours of the arias and then pop back and tell everyone what's going on.
And how you sort of, this has always been that sort of thing with the capo arias, is where, you know, they have one mood, quickly change to another one, and then quickly go back again. And how would you sort of argue that in terms of character? Has it changed by the time we get back to the first subject again?
Yeah, I like to think, if I'm explaining the capo arias to anyone, that it's, you sort of introduce it and then you go through all the angsty emotions, or the sort of human, real, or not necessarily human, but the kind of realization, the brain works everything out in the B section, is often more sort of internal. And then having gone through that experience in the B, you bring the A section back, which is the first bit you heard, and you're free with that thought, that original thought, to then do some wiggly things around that.
Wiggly things.
And it should be wiggly, the technical term. And that should sort of free you up to listen with new ears to the first section. And as the audience, hopefully, you'll kind of understand it slightly more, which is, I think, why we feel free to, not just because you might be bored, to add a few extra things, but because we've got a greater understanding of what happened, is what I like to think.
The work itself is a da capo aria, because you sing the opening aria again at the end. So I guess that's sort of an idea, you know, cyclical nature of the temptations of Icarus, all that stuff. But again, do you feel like there's been a journey that you perform the last movement differently to how you performed it at the beginning?
You know, I actually decided to, for better or worse, to do a very simple da capo for the very last time. I wanted it to be not similar to the Bach, not this kind of fancy version at the end, but through understanding, you get a simple iteration of what you originally said. So whether I'm sure some people would disagree with that, but it was a choice for me to arrive at the end with a almost plainer version of the beginning, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, absolutely. So the second sort of big element is the Bach, which sort of, unlike where Handel was sort of forced to write a not opera, but it turned out being a little opera, Bach's secular work still is quite religious, even though he just can't help himself. And it's very sort of enlightenment about inner peace and all that, that sort of thing. Do you think it still resonates today? Do you think it's still or do you think it's sort of trapped in the 18th century?
I think, as we're always finding with this music, is that it's so pertinent to today, depending on what you believe, but certainly what me and a lot of my colleagues, and I think people I'm surrounded by at least, or surround myself by, believe, which is the text is that wealth and possessions what's the point in collecting them in life when you can't take them with you, and that the real peace is found from within, without all this filigree around you that you collect through life. And we call it, as I said before, we call it a secular cantata. He does use God. It doesn't have a chorale at the end, so we know that probably wasn't written for a Sunday, like Bach would often write his cantatas for. Funnily enough, as Bach always does, is that he says, the title is "I am in myself content," but Bach can't offer us contentment on a plate. And I think probably with that title, you might turn it on and think you're about to be awash with peace and contentment. And actually, there's huge struggle in what you hear, especially in these really long recits that could be quite dense, and their form in the continua, the harmonies he uses, but actually it's quite angular and almost like this pontificating narrator who says that follow my ways, and it could become quite annoying, I think, if you at the time listening to it and thought something else. But we obviously, I'm sure, believe that there's a lot of truth in what he says. But it was a huge challenge for me to get to grips with the German language. And I had a brilliant coach, Norbert Main, who was in the recordings with me and could kind of help make sure that there was some sense going through, that we were all quite literally and metaphorically on the same page with it.
I was going to ask, do you prefer singing in German or Italian? Because especially with these recits, I think that's the language is really it's at the front. You're very exposed. I'm sure there's challenges in either, but what do you prefer?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think probably German is easier, just in terms of there's a lot of, well, in Italian too, but I often think Italian, the line is really important. I mean, it is with both, but you can get an easier line with Italian. But German, like English, there are lots and lots of things you can do to colour, so many more kind of consonant works that you can do. And it just seems slightly more familiar to me in that way. It sits kind of more comfortably in the mouth, I think. And there was a lot more to get my teeth round. So I probably spent more time doing that with the German. So yeah, I'd say German for today, but tomorrow I might tell you something different.
Yeah, those recits are so much fun in the Bach. Did you, I mean, sort of especially compared to the Handel, do you treat them as if when it comes to sort of preparing them, did you treat them as much as the arias? How did you look at them differently?
Yeah, I think I probably spent more time on the recits because I really wanted to show some sort of through thought, to highlight the words and to highlight when you don't have all of the sort of colours going on with lots of different instruments behind you, and you have this amazing continuous section, but you have to do a lot more work to carry the meaning. And especially when you record, sometimes it's hard to find the space and the silences, I find, that you might get when you're looking into people's eyes in an audience, and you can kind of see whether they've got what you've just said, and then you carry on, and you leave those pauses when there's a human connection. But sometimes I think something I learned when I was listening back, sometimes that's either too fast, or there's no space for anyone to understand that unless they've done a bit of homework before and read the translation before putting it on. So I think in this particular cantata, it's not always the case with Bach, but the recit did take a lot more work than the arias, I think.
And once you were in the sort of recording studio, how much sort of sort of discussion was there with when you're working with Ashley Solomon and Florilegium? How much sort of discussion or changes or journey was still being had in the recording studio?
I think what we deal with in this day and age is the challenges in terms of obviously like fundraising for the event, but also the time that we have, as you say. So there was a lot of rehearsal and conversations going on as we were doing it. There wasn't much time to rehearse with everyone prior to the few days that we had to record it. So in terms of tempi, speeds, getting on the same page in terms of what we wanted to achieve, given that, as Bach always does, the text says something and the music beautifully does highlight it, but you kind of have to go through the struggle as well. There was, very open discussion about it. And I hope that, interestingly, doing it in live in front of an audience does change things sometimes. And it probably, if I sung it to you today, it would be different than the recording as well. And so we never get that sort of perfect, ideal version. And I myself, I'm always kind of listening to things and thinking, I would have done that differently, or, we're always our worst critics, but I think that's a good thing in our business. So there was a lot of discussion. It's also quite tricky and interesting having so many brilliant musicians in the room and trying to come to find that one version that everyone's okay with. So it's such a great environment working with Florian. It's always a positive atmosphere. But it would be interesting to sit down with a coffee or something stronger and talk about it after the event maybe, and see what things people were happy with and what they weren't. And I'm sure there'll be a long conversation about it. But for the time being, it was a very positive atmosphere, discussing what we wanted and our kind of expectations and interpretations of what the music said.
And it's nice that Ashley Solomon gets to see, there's the concerto grosso at the beginning, and then there's the Vivaldi, which again, I sort of my first reaction to that was, they sort of feel like overtures to the cantatas, which don't have overtures. So especially because I think concerto, the grosso that it's in G major and the Handel starts in G major. So I wonder, was there? I don't know if you were involved in that sort of picking of the repertoire, but there was obviously the reason that these were put in between the cantatas.
Yeah, definitely. That was something that Ashley brought to the table, and everything he does in that regard is always really well thought through. And I think it really helps the listener to start in a sound world. And we can talk about that sort of the idea of colours and keys and things like that, but we probably don't have time. But I think even subliminally, you feel at home once you've reached when the vocal music starts. You've already got into that world, which is really helpful, I think.
Did he conduct from the flute?
No, actually, we didn't have any no conducting whatsoever. We all did it by feel and eyes and things like that. So
that's where the sort of standing in the circle really must have helped then, because the eye contact.
Yeah, definitely. It is also those things which we had Jared Sachs producing, who's brilliant and always creates a really good sound. But when you think about recording a CD, you don't think, you'll stand there, and not for this disc, but other discs I've done, you kind of stand and then suddenly you've got this black pole in front of you and you can't see so there's all these kind of obstacles and wires and things, but it has to be like that. But I think I could see absolutely everyone. Sometimes sun got in people's eyes and that was a bit difficult, but we always managed to erect some sort of music stand with a coat over, and there are things you can do to try not change the sound, but get through those. So no conductor, but a feeling in the room, a sort of communal feeling of what was happening, I think.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That really adds to that sort of feeling of sort of an intimacy that is in these pieces. Was it also, what was it like recording in the sort of a church space as compared to sort of a muffled studio? How did that feel? How did that affect how you performed?
I think, it's definitely something to get used to, especially as a singer. I'm sure the instrumentalists would say the same, is that you do need a bit of time just to feel how your sound is affected by the things around you. And I think it's probably pretty helpful in some ways to be in a church for the voice, but in other ways it does mean that you don't necessarily hear the sound as directly as you might prefer it, and everyone's hearing a slightly different version of the sound given where we were stood. But I think that it's a brilliant venue, St John the Evangelist in Norwood, and they're really well set up for recordings like that. So we were lucky, and thankfully didn't have sort of planes flying over and things going on outside that we might have to deal with. So that was another good thing.
So the final work, which is quite a sort of it's a very fun ending. I thought it's the Vivaldi Alleluia, which is very unlike any other Alleluia I've heard. I think it's very sort of agitated. What's its sort of position at the end of this album?
I think for me it feels like that sort of sense of relief after being told what to do a few times by the text, the Handel and the Bach, and Vivaldi is a opportunity to show some virtuosity, and kind of it's not very relaxing to perform, but it does have a kind of exhilarating release that I think probably we need the listener to have at the end of trying to be content, trying to not fly too close to the sun and have our wings melted and all that stuff. And I think it's just a sort of free for all, in a way, a plea, just let things be. Alleluia. That's, something positive and energetic.
Yes, it's such a fun bit. How much of this repertoire had you encountered before?
I had done the Vivaldi that we just mentioned in concert in Portugal with Lawrence Cummings. The Casa de Musica have a Baroque orchestra there in Porto. A year before we recorded it, I'd done the whole motet, and the Alleluia comes at the end of that. The Trolle Fiamme I'd done, as I say, probably about 10 years prior to that at the Royal College with Vittorio Guglielmi, who's a brilliant viola da gamba player. He sort of came in to work with the students, and fortunately got to sing that with him in the hall at college. The Bach I hadn't done before, I don't think. Before I started studying for this, I don't think I'd done it in concert. And I think often it is helpful to have had an outing a few times before you put it down. But in this case, it's not often possible, and this was one of the cantatas that Ashley hadn't done, so it was definitely on the list. So yeah, I thankfully get to have it in my repertoire now, and I can repeat it. But it was quite a steep learning curve for me.
For the Handel, coming back to it after a while, was there anything that surprised you, or was a new challenge, or you would obviously have changed as a singer over 10 years, but what was different coming back?
It's so fascinating. Well, just being a human in general, isn't it? The aging process, and I'm 35, and I've hopefully still got a few years left in me. But being a soprano and also kind of lighter, and it's fascinating and terrifying watching and hearing your body change. And yeah, every time I come back to a new piece, it either feels it always feels different, and it either feels really comfortable because it's somewhere in my body already and I know what to do, or it feels like, oh wow, didn't think that would be like that. And I can't really remember which one of these, probably a bit of both this was, but it's definitely took me a little bit of time to reteach my body where things were, given the things I've been able to do since that moment, and since being a student, and everything you sort of carry in your toolbox as a result of the experience, but also sort of wiping the cobwebs away slightly as well, which is a never-ending task for an artist, as I'm sure you're aware.
Across the whole album, what are your favourite moments, or moments you want people to sort of listen out for? Obviously, you want to listen to the whole album, but sort of moments that maybe surprised you, or moments you think, oh, this is actually really special?
Hard for me to answer the special bit, because we're always so judgmental over our own stuff. But I would say for the listener to have a listen to the rest, it's just because it's so, well, for me anyway, it's such an interesting part of the cantata, and I think we like to indulge in the arias, and that's the bit we sort of we might be able to hum along to or feel comfortable in. But it's so fascinating what Bach does, particularly with this cantata. Something I really enjoyed doing was there's a violin solo and soprano. I think it's number 4 in the Bach, which is with Magdalena Lott-Hill, who I was lucky enough to go through college life with. We happened to be the same age, and one of those wonderful moments where you enter a year and you don't know who's going to be in it, but you find these kind of kindred spirits. And I think the lines in that are to do with the man who sort of gets rid of all the treasures will find richness in poverty. And yeah, for some reason, I guess my friendship with her kind of feels like that, if that's not too twee a thing to say. And she inspires me so much. The way she plays Baroque violin is so free and with this inner confidence. And I learnt a lot from her as a colleague and as a friend. So on a personal level, that's a track that I'm really glad to have been able to get down.
I know, and that is proof is that, you know, these may sound sort of lofty old words from 300 years ago, but they do have a meaning today. It's all about being human. And I like, again, this sort of interaction, this human interaction, because a lot of people, especially if they're not particularly into Baroque, they just sort of think, oh, it's all very mechanical, it's all very preludes and fugues. It's still a lot of heart and there's still a lot of sort of push and pull, which I think is, really beautiful. And then people often do like to discount the rest, but they should not in this.
In our case, one of the challenges was that we did 2 rounds of recording, and the first features a brilliant Alex Bellamy and Una Lee, 2 oboists, but the scheduling meant for the second round we had 2 other oboists, and we were joined by the lovely Gail Hennessy and Andras Villalobos-Lepis, and I think that's something that we encounter quite a lot in today's recording world, where sometimes people are changed. But so one of the arias in the cantata that features heavily the oboe, which I think is the second track, or the second movement of the Bach, actually has Gail and Andres in it, and Alex and Una are playing on other tracks, but we did have to create as kind of the similar sound world in the second session, but it was with different instrumentalists, which is another challenge in itself. But I got to sing with 4 rather than 2, so that's kind of lucky for me.
Yeah, again, there is that almost chemistry, you know, they're not characters, they're oboes, but there's still a chemistry there. And yeah, it's just really lovely. Well, thank you so much, Rowan, for this. Thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, very happy to do it.
Thank you so much for listening to this Gramophone Classical Music Podcast. Tra le fiamme is out today on Channel Classics. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do give it a rating or review. And we hope to see you again next week for another Gramophone Classical Music Podcast.